return false inside an event like .click, it says only do what I've written here. So a lot of times when you do some kind of action, your browser already has built in some response to the action that you're doing. When you actually do return false, it disables that response. So a lot of times when you have an element or a link, and you're just using that button just for JavaScript to do something when you clicked it, you'll see like href equals pound. And if you were to not return false and you click that button, it would bring you back to the top of the page. And of course, like, you don't want that all the time, so you do return false, and then it basically ignores whatever is in that href value. So like, actually, if you look at the site right now, we're setting href to the actual page that the link should go. And what happens is if you actually use the physical link that I would redirect you to, if your browser doesn't have JavaScript, you can kind of fall back on actually visiting that link manually. So I'll show you guys a quick example of this. So here's the same code that we saw earlier. And the index, or the HTML file just looks like this. So I'm linking the jQuery library, and I have the code that I've written there. And I have a header element and a button with a class button. So when I view this, if I click this button, it's just going to change the color of it to red, just like what we said. And I'll show you actually really quickly what it looks like if I didn't return false. So if I don't return false, and if you're looking at this, I'm using href equals pound here. If I don't return false, let me refresh this. Then I click button, it jumped back to the top of the page. Do you guys see that? So it actually, I was here and I clicked it, and it brings me to the top of the page.
Is that an anchor?
The A?
Yeah.
Which one? Yeah.
Is that how you return to the top and use an anchor?
Yeah, you can use anchors to return to the top of the page.
Oh wait, but then that right now is done in JavaScript?
No. So the JavaScript is just setting the color of the text to red.
Oh.
And then what I was saying is a lot of times you're going to use buttons to trigger some kind of event.
Oh, okay.
And you don't want it to actually bring you where that button says to bring you. So you're going to return false, and it's just going to not execute that action.
Oh. If you click it again, does it go back to the original state?
No.
You have to set another function.
Yeah, you have to set another function to that. And I mean, you could basically see how you do that. You would just use the same thing, and then just do, instead of red here, you could just do black.
But then, so the browser recognizes when it's already red, and then when you click it again, it'll go back to black. Because you said click, you'll be doing click on both the times. So how is the browser going to differentiate which?
You would have to actually code that. So you could set a variable, and you could do that. jQuery also has a nice function that I think is called like toggle class. And what you can do is, like when you're actually doing this CSS stuff, if you're setting a whole bunch of CSS attributes, you probably don't want to set it like this. What you do instead is in your CSS file, you create a new class with all the attributes you want to set. And instead of applying all the CSS attributes manually one at a time, you just add the class or remove the class. So jQuery actually has something called toggle class, I think, and that would do basically what you want. It would, when you click it the first time, set it. When you click it again, it removes the class. Okay, so I already went over this a little bit. The way that you select elements in jQuery is you just use the $, and you use the same tags that, the same CSS selectors that we're accustomed to using. So this one's going to select the element with ID my element. This is going to select all images. And actually, when you do something like this and you select multiple elements, and you do .css and you set some attribute, or you use some kind of method call on it, it's going to call that method on every single one of those elements simultaneously. So in the previous example, when we did h1, there's only one header, but if there are two headers, it'll set both of them to red. Is that useful to see, or should I show you? Should I show that to you guys, how that happens, or does that kind of make sense? Okay. So now I'm just going to go over briefly some of the basic methods that you're going to be using for jQuery. The first one is .attr, and it's basically going to let you change the attributes of a particular element. So you can actually get the contents or what the attribute is currently set to with just .attr and then the attribute name that you want inside quotes. If you want to set it, then you use two arguments. The first argument is going to be the attribute, and the second argument is going to be the value that you want to set it to. If you want to do multiple attributes, you can actually use a hash. And for those of you that don't really know what a hash is, it's just basically a key and a value. So it's saying set source to this value and set alt to this value. And you use this special syntax with the colons and then a comma between them.
When you select elements, could you do the same thing with nested elements in JavaScript?
Yeah, so you can do nested elements, you can do commas, anything. You can even do hover if you wanted to. So everything that you could have done with CSS selectors, you can do with JavaScript, with jQuery, and I'll understand all of that. Okay. And then the counterpart to the attributes attributes method is basically the CSS method, and you can set all the CSS. Oops, this should be CSS. You can set all the CSS properties just like you could the attribute properties, and it's the same syntax. You can either get the current value of the CSS property with just the name of the property, or you can set just one of the properties with this syntax, or you can set multiple ones. And this should be .css here instead of .html. And then I talked about this a little bit. I talked about toggle class. This is just add class and remove class. So the reason why you want to use this is if you're setting a whole bunch of different CSS. If you're setting a whole bunch of CSS attributes, it's better to just put it into a class in your CSS file and eliminate a lot of that clutter, and just add the class when you need to have all those attributes, or remove them when you need to. What was your question?
Under what situation would you use CSS versus jQuery?
You mean when would you use CSS instead of JavaScript?
Yeah, or vice versa.
So basically, you only want to use JavaScript when something has to change after the page has been loaded. So if you always want your page to look a certain way, just go ahead and write it in CSS and in HTML. And the reason why you want to do that is because if you do it the other way, if you have everything written in JavaScript, you could do that. If you did everything written in JavaScript, then when people actually download your HTML page, there's no content in it. And if their browser doesn't support JavaScript, most of them do now, but if they don't, then they're not going to see that CSS or HTML that you've written. Same thing goes for, I think, Google spiders and search engine crawlers. So if you're doing like search engine optimization, and you're doing stuff after the fact, like loading additional content, changing the CSS, or even adding more content, the spider's not going to see that. So you don't want to do it in that case. And in addition to that, whenever you're running JavaScript, it's something that's actually running on your computer. So it actually has the compute. And if you had a whole bunch of JavaScript running, it'll actually slow down your browser a little bit. So you want to just do everything that you can in CSS and HTML, and only if you're doing something after the fact, in response to a user's action, do you want to do it in JavaScript.
So what about like hovers?
Hovers? So if you can get away with a typical CSS hover, then I would use that. If you're doing something entirely different, then I would use, or if you're doing something more complicated, then I would use JavaScript. So don't use JavaScript in place of what you can already do with HTML and CSS now. Only if you need additional functionality would you use JavaScript. Okay. And I talked about this a little bit earlier also. JavaScript has the ability to tap into the user's actions, so it can tell where your mouse is, if you click something, if you mouse over something. It can also do different things like telling you if you press a button, and it can tell you what button that was. So you can code in a response on your website depending on what button was pressed. So you can actually do hotkeys for your website. There's some other events also that it does. We didn't list all of them here. I would just go to the jQuery documentation website, and you can look up basically all the wonderful events that it lists, and it has basically all the ones that you could ever want. So. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this JavaScript functions, or functions in general. For those of you who have already had a programming background, this should be really familiar. For those of you that haven't had programming background, this should be enough to get you through basically the course and to do most of the things that you need to in jQuery and JavaScript. Basically, what you can do with a function is you can write code inside just this syntax here, and by assigning it a name, so this function has a name, do something, you can actually, because the code is encapsulated within this function, you can actually run that function later at any time. So if you didn't use a function and you just typed out your code, it would execute it just basically whenever the JavaScript was loaded. But sometimes you only want something to happen in response to an action, like you click something, then you put that inside of a function, and you can then reference all the code inside of here with the name. And in addition to that, you can pass different variables to it, so you can pass parameters inside your function. And if you use functions, so if you're reusing code a lot, it's nice to just write in a function, and you can pass in different variables to kind of do different things. So you could write a function that takes in an element, and you can pass it different elements and do the same thing on that element. And what that allows you to do is it just cuts down on code repetition. So just the same reasons why we want to link things externally. It just refactors your code and minimizes it. So this is something that is a little bit unique to JavaScript, even for those of you who have a programming background. You can actually write anonymous functions in JavaScript. An anonymous function is just basically a function that doesn't have a name attached to it. So a lot of the time you're just using a function for an event handler, and you just want when you click the element with ID target for it to do something. And in this case, you don't actually need to name your function and then refer to it later. You can just write it all in line. So JavaScript lets you do that. So here's a function, and there's just basically no name there, and it's passed to .click. So when you click it, it's just going to execute whatever's in here, basically. Okay, and that was it. Are there any questions about the functions? I know I glossed over it a little bit. You guys will be dealing with it in the lab today. And I think John next week is going to go into a little bit more about actually programming with JavaScript, and I'll probably ask him to go over function usage again, things like that. Okay, so if there are no questions, then please just finish the course feedback if you haven't finished that already, and the lab should be up as well.